It's a great privilege as well as a pleasure to be here among so many young, hopeful, aspiring, and well qualified and also well dressed young people who are going to go out in the world today. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'm here because of you. I hope that what I say may have some bearing on the decisions you make, the choices you make as you go into the real world a few weeks from now. What I'm going to basically talk about is, can you go back to the earlier slide, please? I'm just going to share with you some experiences that I've had working in the area of culture and by extension tourism, because the two are inextricably related at many levels. We have to understand that a country and a people and a society's identity is extremely important for the development of that society. It is important to have a strong and well-balanced sense of your own identity. It gives you the confidence that Mr. Goyal was talking about earlier today. A society which has a strong as well as a well-balanced sense of its own identity makes a very good building block for development in the future. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that we always say that tourism is a driver for development. Certainly it is. But tourism is a driver for development when that society and that community and country, such whatever it may be, has the ability to absorb the good effects of tourism. Sometimes there are also ill effects of tourism. And if your own self-worth and community and identity is not well developed, you will not be able to absorb the good effects of tourism and use it as a development tool. Remember that you are always in control, or you should be in a position of control. And cultural heritage has quite a lot to contribute towards building this sense of your own confidence and identities, ensuring that you are in a position to control whatever development that you may wish to bring about. Speaking from the perspective of cultural heritage today, culture is a very exciting space today. Culture is no longer confined to just monuments or sites, or even on the other end of the spectrum, just some dance performances and music and so on. There is a growing realization the world over that culture is much more than just its manifestations, that there are a lot of interlinkages. There are forms of transmission of cultures. How were these performing arts and crafts and so on that you see lying as products in front of you? How have the knowledge been transmitted over the generations? That also is a part of culture. The entire context within which you see a monument, the villages next to it, the houses, the people, the priests who come to worship at the temple, the community of devotees who come to that temple and make their offerings there. Their whole daily lives are regulated by these sort of shrines, and so we see them as just one monument sitting in the middle of a field. But for those people, that is the driver of their daily routine, and it becomes a part of their lives. That also is a part of culture. Traditional knowledge systems, craft forms, cuisines, food, building techniques, the famous monasteries of the Satriya cult in Majuli Island, which is becoming a bigger and bigger tourist attraction. The greatness about those monasteries is not in their monumental structure. They are very ordinary looking structures, but it is the way of building, the use of sand and bamboo shreds that they use in building those structures. Every year they get flooded, every year they are repaired and rebuilt. That is the cultural form. That is what is worth nominating for a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as Majuli Island is going for a World Heritage nomination. So these are the aspects of culture that we are increasingly becoming sensitized to, and there are a lot of people, young people like yourselves, who are taking up jobs, if you will, or who are taking up building institutions in this area. There are people who are doing heritage walks, for example. There are people who are working with communities of wandering musicians in Rajasthan, the camel drivers of Rajasthan, recording their music. There are a lot of very interesting projects that are happening in the field of cultural heritage. If one could be aware of them and then try to integrate them in a form that becomes sustainable and then get the tourism aspect in, that would be the ideal process of integration. And that integration needs to be there if we are going to sustain tourism. Otherwise, tourism can become a very big weapon also. It can become a very detrimental factor, and it can really destroy societies. Next, please. So this is a view of the pristine waters of Chilka Lake in Odisha. It is one of the largest. It's a combination of saltwater and sweetwater lake. It has a unique ecosystem. It is nominated by the Ramsar Convention. You must be familiar with these international conventions, the Convention on Wetlands. It is also severely under threat. Severely. It is under threat by overfishing. The prawns of Chilka Lake are desired all over the world. They go all over Southeast Asia, China. In fact, from Balugaon, which is on the banks of the Chilka Lake, the prawns are just packaged and flown straight to Bangkok and so on. Some of them are flown to the Calcutta market, but the other thing that is severely endangered is the livelihoods of these fishing communities. Increasingly, there are mechanized fishing boats. Increasingly, the nets that are used are very small. So they pick up more fish. They also pick up the baby fish. Traditionally, the nets had they were of a certain size, so that they would release the small fish. That was a form of sustainable fishing, so that the small fish would grow up and then they would fish them when they grow, and so on, But now, because of the greed of the commercial interests that are involved, the nets are small. They pick up the baby fish. They're depleting the fish stock. So the local fishermen who go in these big wooden boats, the traditional dongas, they cannot compete with those mechanized fishing interests. And consequently, people are forgetting how to make these boats. There are very few people left who even have this knowledge. This is what one may call traditional knowledge systems. They are also not able to actually be their own entrepreneurial jobs that they used to do. They were the fishermen. They would catch the fish and the women would sell it. There was a certain gender balance in the community. The men would catch the fish, the women would sell it. That is all almost gone now, because the fish is now no longer sold in local markets. The local people cannot afford to eat the fish they catch. Next, please. So now, what we want to do today is try to identify some trends and international and national trends in tourism, and try and figure out, if we can, some general principles of sustainable tourism and look at some case studies, as well as finally try to look at the opportunities and pitfalls that tourism presents to us, and that I was trying to illustrate through this case study. We'll go into this in more detail later. Next, please. Okay. Anyway, this slide was about all sorts of figures that I'm sure that you've seen. If we can get the slide back, we'll just skip over it. Basically, international trends in tourism show that tourism is one of the biggest drivers, as everybody has told us today. As I'm sure you know, it is perhaps even in line with other industries like oil and automobiles and so on, and with the potential to grow if it is pushed forward in a sustainable manner. If tourism becomes unsustainable, then one finds that one has really destroyed the very goose that lays the golden eggs. Okay, so all those billions and trillions of figures, I'm sure you all know. You do, don't you? This is all stuff you're familiar with, right? Yes? Yes? Okay. Next, please. Now, okay, just hold on this slide. I don't know if all of you are familiar with some of the conventions which are there, which influence this sector. Now, the way the legal framework, the legislative frameworks work, there are some certain international conventions and agreements, and bilateral and multilateral, it could be either way. Now, those kind of agreements, we must remember, this is of course one lesser known one, which is why I'm highlighting it. In the area of heritage tourism, it is the World Heritage Convention of 1972. Have all of you heard of that? Yes? Yes? The World Heritage Convention 1972, of which India is a signatory. India is a signatory to this as well. That governs your entire network of World Heritage Sites, UNESCO World Heritage Sites. UNESCO, as you may know, is the only multilateral agency internationally with a specific mandate to address cultural heritage. If it addresses cultural heritage, by inference it will also address issues of cultural heritage tourism. So, given their expanding mandate, UNESCO also, after the World Heritage Convention, which went on for, and about 20 years later it was reviewed and so on, UNESCO has then thereafter passed various conventions on intangible cultural heritage, which cover the various areas that I was talking to you about earlier. Yeah? Traditional knowledge systems, performing arts, forms of training, learning, and so on, crafts. And UNESCO has now passed 2 or 3 conventions in trying to protect these kinds of heritage, which is extremely endangered. It is in a way more endangered than built heritage. Because look, Taj Mahal will keep standing even if it rains or whatever happens. But a language form or a knowledge of a particular kind of cuisine or any particular kind of craft, that will die out when the generation dies. After that person who knows, if he does not pass on the knowledge, it's gone. And we are losing so many such types of intangible heritage every single day. You must have heard about that dialect in the Andaman Islands. That was last speaker passed away, the lady, and it was gone. So intangible heritage is much more vulnerable than built heritage. That's what I say anyway. And a lot of other people say also. Next, please. So in India, tourism has great potential, but we have to be very careful dealing with tourism. It's interesting that the report on the 12th five-year plan has encouraged heritage tourism, giving a big boost to heritage tourism, rural tourism, ecotourism, and endogenous tourism. These are all forms of localized, decentralized tourism development. Why decentralized? Mostly because the more you centralize something, of course you need to have certain enabling legislations at the center as well. But the more you decentralize it and decontrol it, the more room you give for local entrepreneurship and innovation. And both those aspects are something that you people actually become key in driving and pushing those kind of initiatives. And we'll see how you can do that later. In terms of, just to return to the conventions and laws and so on, there need to be certain enabling legislations. In the tourism sector, from the perspective of heritage tourism, there is of course the Ancient Monuments and Sites Remains Act of 1958. You are all familiar with that? Yeah? The Ancient Monuments Act of 1958, that governs all sites of the Archaeological Survey of India. There are about 3,500 such sites. And those are that's all your Taj Mahal, Konark, Khajuraho, and so on and so on. All the ASI monuments come under that act. That act, then the UNESCO conventions, for example, the World Heritage Convention is activated, operationalized in India through the Ancient Monuments Act. So the international convention, which is actually a multilateral agreement with different countries signing. If my country signs the convention, it says, all right, I agree with this. Then how will I operationalize it? How will I demonstrate my commitment? I have to have a law in my country to operationalize that. I'm sure, I'm giving the example of cultural heritage. I'm sure you have that same thing, international treaties and so on, in other sectors like aviation and so on, right? So the Ancient Monuments Act at the national level operationalizes the World Heritage Convention for built intangible heritage. And Government of India also through agencies like Indira Gandhi Center for the Arts and so on, we don't yet have a law for intangible heritage in the Indian Constitution. We don't. But they are also committed to operationalizing the preserving the oral and intangible cultural heritage of the country. So looking at the enabling legislations in India for cultural heritage, actually it is predominantly the Ancient Monuments Act of 1958, which has recently been amended also. The Act gives an area, a buffer zone of about 100 meters around every monument and site, within which development has to be extremely controlled. That means you can't just build hotels right next to a heritage site. If historically there have been some buildings there, then those buildings cannot expand, or they need very severe, there are restrictions on expansion. Okay, so there are restrictions on development around the monument, protected monument. That is why it is important to list monuments for protection. Listing of monuments and sites is a very key issue, because if you find a heritage site somewhere, it is of local or regional or national significance. It can be just of local significance. But only if you notify it in a particular list will that site be protected. Otherwise, any road or any builder or anyone can come and just remove the site. But if it is protected, you can actually have a judicial proceeding if someone breaks that site. Next, please. So this is what we were talking about, that there's a lot of thrust given to pro-poor tourism, ecotourism, endogenous tourism and so on. This is all part of an impetus to decentralize tourism development and to encourage local innovation and local entrepreneurship. Next, please. Okay, now we'll just have a look at a visitor study that was done as part of the site management plan for Ellora Caves. Now, Ellora Caves near Aurangabad town in Aurangabad district in Maharashtra is a World Heritage Site. There are about 34 caves. It's a very historic region. It is also linked to a lot of to a historic. The larger region is also historic. Aurangabad, of course, was the site of Aurangzeb's capital in the Deccan. It was a city built by him. Then you have Daulatabad Fort, which is another very historic fort, a pre-Mughal fort, a great medieval fort structure, which is about 3 kilometers from the cave site. And then you have Khuldabad town, which is the place where Aurangzeb was buried. It is a great Sufi center of 14th and 15th century. So this Ellora, Khuldabad, Daulatabad, Aurangabad is like a quadrangle. It's a great heritage, and shows development from the 5th, 6th century onwards. Because the Ellora caves basically were built by, the building started in the Buddhist period from the 6th, 7th centuries, and then it went on right up to the 11th century, after which the dynasty shifted to Daulatabad. So the other interesting and important, the main building in the Ellora caves is the great temple of Kailashnath. The Kailash temple of Ellora is an amazing structure. It was carved out of living rock, and it shows the crossover between the cave excavated temples to the freestanding temples. So this is what is called a rock cut temple. And it was literally made, and I don't know how, I can't even imagine what engineering must have been in the 8th century to have made 3 vertical slashes in a whole mountain and carved a temple from top to down. There is a legend that the queen of that place said that she wants to see the spire of the temple, the Amalaki, the spire of the temple, otherwise she will not eat any food. And a lot of architects came, and the queen was meanwhile starving, and the king was getting frantic and so on. And then finally one architect came, and he said, okay, I'll do it. And he cut this rock and carved the spire first. He carved the round Amalaki, the top of the temple first. And he told the queen, he says, here, now you've seen it, you now break your fast. And then he began carving the rest of the temple. So it was a trick, but that is one of the legends in the local place. And these kind of myths and legends are very important when you develop the significance of the site for visitors when they come in. The other interesting thing about it is that there is a very ancient tirtha and temple, the Grishneshwar temple, which is right next to, it's a great shrine to Lord Shiva, and it is right next to the half a kilometer, it is 600 yards from the main Kailashnath temple. In fact, the Grishneshwar temple is a living temple. The Ellora caves are dead. The carvings, the lavish carvings on the Ellora caves are actually like a film cast on a screen, the rituals of which are being performed in the Grishneshwar temple. The pilgrims to Grishneshwar temples are the main influx of visitors to this region. Fewer people come to see Ellora caves, more people come as pilgrims to Grishneshwar, and then the spillover comes and sees Ellora caves. So ASI has actually changed its policy. It shuts down all sites on Mondays, but Ellora cave is the only ASI site that is open on Mondays, because Monday is the day when the biggest darshan of Shiva is there at Grishneshwar, and the Grishneshwar pilgrims then come into the ASI cave site. So you see the power of the local tourism and the power of the devotee tourism that is there. And yet, Japan Foundation gave a very large sum of money for developing roads, infrastructure, visitor amenities. Nothing was developed in Grishneshwar or the village. Everything was done in the Ellora cave site. Okay? The road was made, highway was made, certainly, but there's no road in the village. So the villagers when we did our study, we had to go and interact. We did a lot of community consultations, and people were very fed up of the entire World Heritage infrastructure. The infrastructure benefits were not coming to them. And it's because of them, and they say that most of the pilgrims come and stay with us in the village. The village has to be able to absorb that kind of visitor inflow. This is a prime example of how community is not taken into consideration when infrastructure is put in place. Price Waterhouse did a study on this whole area, and they did not highlight this major factor, that the people from Grishneshwar are the ones who are coming and working as guides and tour operators in the site. There is a direct livelihood impact from the tourist site onto the village. There is a link of human resources. There is a physical infrastructure impact, and yet nobody is seeing that. Nobody is able to figure that out. Next, please. Various aspects were examined. Profiling of visitors was done. It was realized that domestic visitors formed an overwhelming and a constant majority. You see, foreign visitors come in what is called the seasons. But it's the domestic visitors which come periodically, because there are monthly, weekly, tri-monthly festival cycles. So those guys are always coming, even though the foreign visitors come during the seasonal period. There is quite a lot of Buddhist visitors, so it has the potential to be a very important Buddhist site. The main thing is that the stakeholders are not being integrated. There's no working mechanism. So, for example, Maharashtra Tourism Development Corporation does not talk to ASI. The two are at cross purposes. Both of their areas of control are adjoining each other. ASI's wall ends here, MTDC's jurisdiction begins here. And all MTDC, what they're doing, they're developing some interpretation center, putting in some buildings. ASI, they haven't told ASI. The plans are not discussed, they're not passed. So even this basic level of stakeholder interaction and integration does not take place. And what to say that you will actually have community consultations and discuss with visitors. MTDC, rather than putting in that interpretation center, which is not required, they put in replicas of the cave inside the interpretation center, 500 yards from the main cave site. Why would you see a replica of Kailash Temple when Kailash Temple is 500 yards away? It doesn't make sense. It is just a matter of two state agencies showing one-upmanship amongst the others. So they said, okay, ASI controls the Kailash Temple, so we'll build a replica. This sort of thinking is not integrated and they are very far from discussing with the District Rural Development Agency, from the discussing with the district magistrate, with the irrigation, CPWD, PWD, and so on, and other forest departments. That is the sort of multi-agency interaction, integration that you need in order to operationalize a proper integrated and planning for the region. There are a lot of crafts, there are a lot of local products, all of which could form a market for the visitors as they come in. Because visitors come in, see the caves, and then they say, what do we do after this? We can just walk around here and there among the cave complex. If there was a market where they could go and see the local products, the temple products, they could participate in temple ritual, they could be given literature as well as have integrated heritage walks that could take them with somebody explaining to them, then it would be a much more rewarding experience. Next, please. So there are positive trends as well as some problem areas. Of course, visitors are increasing. Annual increase of visitors is there. The larger and larger number of domestic visitors. The hospitality industry has also improved. And more locals are involved. But what happens? Without the integrated planning, you'll have all sorts of unsuitable buildings, wrongly designed hotels. You'll have increasing solid waste problems. You'll have more and more garbage. The Yale Ganga river, which used to flow nearby, has almost dried up. And whatever remains has become a drain in which there is nothing but plastic bottles thrown in. There is no solid waste management. There is no garbage collection. There is no roads, proper road building, street lighting, public spaces development. Far be it from, impacting the school's curriculum and so on, which is what it should be doing. So the benefits of international funding and international development and so on are not trickling down into the local region. And this is exactly the thing. We have these great and grand international conventions. We may even have a national law, a legal framework, but at the local level, none of that is, we are not able to observe that. Next, please. So one thing which in fact came out of the local interactions was this notion of the village level development committee. They told us that, madam, do people understand Hindi? Mostly? Okay. कि हमारे जो बच्चे हैं, are the youth and students that we have, they are educated, but they frequently don't have employment. They can form entrepreneurial groups, set up hospitality, accommodation, food, this, that, and provide visitor services. They wanted to set up an electric battery-powered auto service for just transporting local people, because that is a great need in that area. Now, these were great ideas coming from them. We need some sort of enabling structure So these kind of little entrepreneurships through either self-help group model or a small private limited company model, we need them to be just guided to do this, to organize themselves. They can be actually affiliated to the panchayat because self-help groups are affiliated to panchayat. They can take loans through NABARD for getting initial infrastructure. It can all be worked out. It just needs some amount of guidance and incubation. Let's move on. Next, please. Okay, now the story moves to Punjab. Punjab has been quite successful in recent times in showing implementation of funds and so on that they have received from Ministry of Tourism. They have developed 2 circuits across the state with 2 themes. One is the land of the Sikh gurus and the other is the land of the freedom struggle. So those are the 2 USPs, major selling points in Punjab, and they have developed sites specific to these circuits, sites identified with the Sikh gurus, the birthplace of X and the place where so-and-so achieved enlightenment. And similarly with various freedom fighters, the birthplace of Bhagat Singh, the home of Lala Lajpat Rai, the great freedom leaders, and places of historic importance. And they have developed these in the form of circuits, which are now, of course, being further developed. There's fairly good road connectivity in Punjab. It is their rural and endogenous tourism structure is also doing quite well. They have registered a large number of farmhouses and so on, because Punjab has a large diaspora community. A lot of NRIs want to keep coming back. One, they want to come back because they want to visit the Golden Temple, if they're the Sikh community. Even non-Sikhs want to do that. And the other thing is that there's the nostalgia tourism, because they want to come back to the Pind, the village, and try to live the life which their fathers and grandfathers told them about. So they want to experience that. So keeping that in mind, these rural tourism and so on, they've prepared a register which is on the website, and people are developing farmhouses and so on. I would say the regulations in terms of the actual structure and the services, that leaves a bit to be desired, but at least they've started the process, so it's not a bad trend. Government of India has also in the 13th Finance Commission given a fairly large sum of funds to Punjab for development of cultural heritage. So for cultural heritage also they have quite a lot of decent amount of funding. Next, please. Now this is one community I would like to draw your attention to. Has anyone heard of Thateras? They are a group of metal workers. They work with using hammers on metal plates. They hammer out designs and make these pots and thalis and various kinds of the very large utensils were made by them. This was a particular historic community of Thateras that migrated from Pakistan, and the Muslim Thateras which were here migrated from India to Pakistan, and the group which came from Pakistan to India. And they are still there. There were 400 families initially. There are roughly the same number of families there even now. However, the craft is dying out very fast. It's dying. Next, please. Yeah. It's most of their work is all, of course, done by hand. The plates of metal are rolled out in a rolling mill, and then the Thateras buy those plates and cut it by hand and rivet it and make the pots and everything by hand. So naturally, the market for copper and pital and kansa, those alloy bronze utensils, the market is obviously getting lower and lower in terms of people are not eating and cooking in those utensils anymore. However, the boutique markets are booming, but they have not been tapped into. These guys need design development and marketing linkages. The main problem is that they are not organized into an association, or again the same thing, they need an organization. They need to either as a company or a society or whatever. Then the main issue is that this is not recognized anywhere as a heritage product. These people have to compete for raw materials. They need scrap metal. They have to compete as individuals for raw material. They are competing with Hawkins pressure cooker people. They are competing with big, huge corporations. How can they survive? They cannot withstand the tax regime. VAT is charged on them. Now, as poor individual craftsmen, they cannot hope to compete with this sort of industry. Plus, government initially used to have a subsidy on copper and kansa and so on. They've removed that. They used to get some scrap from the army. That scrap has since then finished off, and so that subsidy is gone and so on. So the modern taxation regime and the fiscal regime and so on, they cannot compete with in the open market. Therefore, someone has to realize that this is actually a cultural heritage product. Like you protect the Taj Mahal, you need to protect the craft and the knowledge of the Thateras. We need to figure out how that is going to be done. Next, please. So one of the interventions, one of the first steps that has already been initiated is they have been proposed for inclusion. India has proposed their name for inclusion on UNESCO's intangible heritage list. And their organization has been, they used to have some sort of defunct organization that has been revived to give some voice to the craftsmen. There is an NGO that has started working. Thanks to all this, various activities and development as part of this, when we started including them on the UNESCO list, then the Punjab government got very interested. And they included it in their program for endogenous tourism development. They said, usme dal do. And therefore, some funds were put aside and NGO was got. That NGO has been doing surveys and trying to organize them and trying to, also do sensitization, focus group discussions. It's a very small community. I mean, there are barely about 4,000 or 5,000 people here. So, you're working with them is not that difficult. So, no. This is only localized in one place. That's what I'm saying. These are small pockets. If we can develop the small pockets, keeping in mind the whole country and try to integrate them. So if you develop the Thateras of Jandiala in Amritsar, link them with the Thateras of Nagaur in Rajasthan, link them with the Thateras of Jaipur, you'll be able to have a lot of cross-fertilization as well as gathering strength, which would be able to corner very good markets. Now this NGO that is working with them right now is linked with IKEA and various other, what is that, those big British stores. Bloomingdale's is American, whatever. These British stores. So they, abroad. So basically they export their products. They will do design development. Instead of thali, perhaps, they'll make salad bowls. Or they make flower pots or lamps. And that is what design development is about when people work in the area of craft design. So now, having said that, we should not only concentrate on the craft, we are also equally concentrating on the built physical environment. So there's an integrated strategy comprising conservation of their old buildings. Their old buildings are still there, some of them wooden buildings, balconies and so on. So building conservation, providing sewerage and sanitation, training of youth in the craft as well as management training. Okay, so some of the young people everyone may not want to be a craftsman. Some person also needs to be the guy who's running the organization, the guy who's making the phone calls, the guy who's downloading from the net. You need some managers out there among them. So training of the youth, outreach, design development, that is basically making your market linkages for export of the product. We've also created linkages with the District Rural Development Agency and the District Industry Center. Now remember that let us not always reinvent the wheel. When the government has provided some systems at the district level, DRDA is there, DIC is there, why not work with them? Our first port of call should be to talk to those guys there. Get them interested, and most of the time they are very nice people there. They just need good ideas and good people to help them, that's all. So reach out to them, they'll come in with schemes. Use their schemes. The schemes will provide funds, manpower, resources, and so on, as well as give it a credibility and anchor it within the system. Don't try to make parallel systems all the time. Stay within the system, use the system as much as possible. Next, please. And the third one, we come to coastal Odisha, which is what we actually started with. This was a part of a World Bank sponsored project on coastal zone management. The World Bank has taken up coastal zone management, building up tourism, appropriate tourism, sustainable tourism as an alternative livelihood to fishing and other areas which are under threat, severely under threat. This is what I was telling you about. Next, please. So, as a first stage, they have taken up 8 heritage sites. They are temples along the coast, temple or can be a colonial building, any heritage building, and trying to develop tourism around that. So, for example, you have an area, and the ecological significance of this place is beautiful. It is amazingly beautiful. Part of it is on Chilka Lake and part of it is on open sea. The area which is on open sea is a nesting place for the olive ridley turtles. You have a lot of nature tourism happening there. You have a lot of visitors coming in from across the world to see the nesting of the olive ridley turtles. These are the turtles that, you must have heard of them. They swim across from Australia once a year. They come to the east coast of India. I'm not sure if they come to Pondicherry or not, but they certainly come to Odisha and parts of the Andhra coast.
In Tamil Nadu, a few sectors in the marina coming from Tamil Nadu and Pondicherry. There's a few sectors where they come.
Okay, so these are usually where those olive ridley turtles really know their way around the world. They know where they have to come every year. They come there, lay their eggs, and when they hatch, they go back into the sea and they go off. So these nesting sites of the olive ridley turtles are of huge ecological significance, and if people start building hotels and buildings and restaurants on the beaches, as they are doing now in Odisha, those sites are endangered and will be completely lost. Those turtles will be lost because they will have nowhere to nest. All the working population gets up and goes off and work to other states. They go to Andhra, they come to Tamil Nadu, they go to Calcutta, as labor. Now this leads to big social gaps in the villages. There's nobody to work in their own fields. Their own remaining families, which may be either small children or old parents, are all starving. So, you have a big demographic imbalance happening here. Now these guys come back after 9 months. They come back for 2-3 months. Then they do some agriculture, which is just not enough. The local agricultural land is lying underutilized. So there's all sorts of problems, social issues and economic issues that are happening. And this kind of society, imagine if tourists just start coming in. Just imagine if hundreds of visitors start coming into these kind of villages, which are depopulated, impoverished, empty fields lying, empty houses lying. Can you imagine when visitors start coming in, what will be the state of the whole society? It will be terrible. Next, please. So these are basically the problems: under optimization of agriculture, problems with fishing as a major livelihood because fishing is becoming unviable, unemployment and underemployment. You have a lot of educated youth which is sitting underemployed because working in the fields is just not feasible, and they are educated and there's nothing for them to do. And of course, the lack of sanitation and solid waste management infrastructure makes tourism a terrible threat, because I can literally see the piles of plastic bags and plastic bottles piling up, and there's no way to dispose of the whole thing. Next, please. Now, what are their strengths? I mean, these are outstanding ecological assets, outstanding heritage assets of great significance, prevalence of traditional knowledge systems, stone crafts, even the fish boat building, plus textiles, embroidery, shell work. There's a whole lot of craft there which is undocumented. Educated youth and actually a culturally very aware populace. They're extremely articulate and they know exactly what is happening. They just don't see a way out of the problem. Next, please. So what did we do? We did an initial diagnostic study. We did village level consultations across different stakeholder groups. You have to identify who are the stakeholders, the different caste, class, occupational groups and so on. You need to do a community profiling. You need to identify the problems. Next, please. Then at the next level, we did a village level consultative workshop at each site. So we did this through the panchayats or through the local schools, either way, in which the panchayat was also associated. At that stage, we shared our plans. You go in there and share plans. You don't just go to them and keep saying, okay, what's your problem? Okay, what's your problem? They'll get fed up and they'll say, go away, don't waste our time. We have to work. You go and you say, this is a project, here is the plan. Now you tell me, do you agree with this? Do you think it will work? If not, tell me what are the gaps and tell me how to fill it. And we will see whether that can be filled or not. Everybody's argument cannot also be taken on board. That is the whole process of public consultation that UN does. Next, please. Then there was a state level workshop that was held in the state capital, in which teams from all across the villages, selected teams from different stakeholder groups, were invited to share. And then the themes and the final drafts were shared with them, and then they gave their inputs. And basically what emerged was a feasible management structure for managing this development of eco and rural and cultural tourism. Next, please. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick update on this, and I've taken a lot of time, so I'll just close after that. If we look at a village level heritage and ecotourism development committee at the village level, okay, a committee which can be a subcommittee of the panchayat, okay. Under that you have self-help groups which are entrepreneurial. The committee is not entrepreneurial. The committee is a coordinating structure at a village level. How many of you are have a village background? How many of you have lived in villages? Okay, enough. Okay, so you will know at least firsthand what I'm talking about. The village level committee has entrepreneurial groups doing things like skills development or food and hospitality or solid waste management. All these are for-profit activities. Okay, they are market-driven for-profit activities. That it will come as part of a business plan for the region. Above the village level committee, okay, the village level committee gets skills training and capacity building from the district agencies, DRDA, District Rural Development Agency, District Industry Center, and so on. The district administration must be roped in at an intermediary level under either the district collector or an officer deputed by him. Above that comes a state level program management unit. At the state level, there must be a unit, and the institutions that are feeding into the state level unit are your IITTM and various other specialized organizations like yourselves. Okay, management schools and so on. In fact, we got XIM Bhubaneswar to agree, the Xavier Institute of Management agreed to incubate the village level committee. They said we will adopt 5 such committees every year and incubate it for 3 years. Okay, which means the student, as their projects, the students will go every month, check on them, how many people have been employed, how many, you can develop your indicators for doing that. Okay, so NABARD, all these agencies come in at the state level. Okay, the MOUs are signed at that level. The implementation takes place through the committee, village level committee at the local level. Okay, so this was accepted by the state government. Now let's see, they may make changes to it or whatever, but this was looked upon as a feasible model for developing ecotourism in a decentralized, localized manner. Next, please. Okay, this I've already explained to you. Next, please. Yeah, this also I've explained to you. Next. Okay, so just in conclusion, if you want to look at a methodology for sustainable tourism development, you need to do certain amount of secondary research. You need to know your site very well, historical, archival, ethnographic research. In your primary level research, you need to know you need to do a sweeping profile of the whole place, a demographic, ethnographic profile, and a development profile for the region. Health, education, livelihoods, what are the figures? You'll get all this from secondary records as well as by doing a questionnaire-based research. And then you have a series of community workshops in which you share your maps, plans, and so on, and bring in institutions for providing expertise, institutions such as yours. Build upon existing structures. Do not try to evolve new structures where they can be avoided. And please look at multi-stakeholder cooperation, ensure synergy between various government departments and agencies, and finally notify your legislations and plans. Notify them so that they will have legal sanction, they will have teeth, and they can be enforced. Okay? So I think, next? Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you so much.
And impacts. You know, airline industry was a glamour industry. It was for the high class and the privileged travel. But today, globalization has made it so small that everyone can afford. Anyone can go and buy a ticket for 1 rupee and pay some taxes and is able to fly. You know, this was the. We see the aviation industry, it creates lots of jobs, both direct and indirect way. And when there is always a positive angle, there are some negative angles, and it comes at the challenges. There is the influence of new technology, and there was a economic regulation and restriction, and the barriers were restricted, and altogether led into what we say, turning aviation into a commodity. So the word commodity, whenever we commoditize anything, it has a certain expiry date. Today is the same case in global aviation. If you look into the West, even the America's aviation is bleeding, though Europe is bleeding, here the Southeast Asian is bleeding. Okay, next. Then there are three major landmarks in global aviation. If you look into 1978, it was the deregulation of US airspace. US is one of the countries which was front runner in every aspect. They were the very organized people in global aviation scenario, and that is the 78 was the beginning when US deregulated the airspace. And in 1990, we saw the emergence of low-cost carriers worldwide. You know, Southwest Airlines of United States of America was the first pioneer airline to introduce the low-cost concept. It was way back in 1970. It was an airline which gave low-fare tickets with a leather seat. You know. Then followed in 1985 came the Ryanair. If America's was Southwest, answer to Southwest was Ryanair. Then came 1990, the biggest achievement in India was the Open Sky policy. That is the entry of private airlines. First Jet Airlines and Air Sara was introduced in 1990. Then came 1997 where the deregulation of European airspace. UK had deregulated, but the whole of Europe didn't. So in the year 1997, it was fully deregulated. Then if you look into the trends in global aviation industry, now the trends have been changed from traditional approach to a very, into a modern trends like emergence of alliance and network strategies, the Star Alliance, the One World, the Sky Team. These are the three pioneer alliances. Then the change in strategic approach of the LCC carriers and the full-fledged carriers. You know, full-fledged carriers have their different objectives, low-cost carriers have different objectives. Then came the industrialization, the industrial relations and the unionization. If you look into this point of industrial relation and the unionization, it has created a huge impact. You know, nowadays the relation between the employee and employer is not that so strong. And unionization, there is a pilot union, there is a cabin crew union, there is an airport union. Yeah, and these all things not only directly affect the service sector like aviation industry, it affects the whole of the economy of the country. Recently, you must be aware of the Qantas strike in Australia, where all the Qantas flights were grounded. The second thing happened in Heathrow, where all the British Airways people and the British Aviation Aerospace Committee, they went for a strike. You know, many people are stranded. This is not only a loss to their organization, but it's a loss to the whole of the economy. Then came the role of the cabin crew pilots and the cabin crew members and the management. If management is not agreeing to the pilots, pilots are going for a strike or they are leaving the organization and going. Where does the airline will bring pilots? And feeding a pilot is not a small job. A pilot is paid a near about a salary of 60 to 70 lakhs per annum. A commander itself. You can imagine what is the salary. For a 2 pilots, you pay 70 lakhs at one go, then the cabin crew follows. Then came the influence of cross-border mergers and acquisitions. Cross-border mergers and acquisitions, though in our part of geographical location is not popular, but in the West, especially the Europe of the smaller size, it is quite common. Like Air France and KLM. KLM is one of the world's oldest airlines. Then came the Lufthansa and the Swiss. When Swiss was bleeding under the bankruptcy, Lufthansa took it over. Then the new concept came, the emergence of bankruptcies, that is the US Airways, Delta Airlines and American Airlines. American Airlines is the world's largest airlines with more than 670 instruments. Instruments are called the flights. Okay, both wide body and narrow body. Then wide market area coverage for alliances and trade to independent carriers. I'll give a point on that. Then came competition with other modes of transport. So other modes of transport was a high-speed rail network in the US and the Europe. Europe has a very good system called the Rail Europe, which is connected from airport to airport, city center to city center, everything. So a person why will go in a flight, going in a congested road for 3 hours, wait in the terminal, the flight will take off for 45 minutes, then again land. So you waste another 4 to 5 hours. Directly from city center, from London city center, St. Pancras to Paris Nord, you travel in train, it is 3 hours, finished, with a lower price. There is the rising cost of aviation and airport taxes and fees. This is a bonding topic. Because of the aviation and airport taxes and fees. Airport taxes and fees in India, especially if you look, it is quite different. Delhi charges 100, Bangalore charges 100, Hyderabad charges 100, Chennai charges 100. Even the air turbine fuel, which is called the ATF, Delhi Terminal T3 is costlier rather than Terminal T1 in Delhi. This is why there is a shift between the airline. Now, if you look into Kingfisher, Jet, they all were introduced into Terminal 3, but they have stopped operation because of the high ATF. Then came the switching over to the other modes of transport for journeys less than 8 hours. 8 hours, if you think, for example, Chennai, 8 hours. Take the example of Australia. Sydney to Perth is a 5 hours journey. In India, we don't have any domestic sector which is more than 5 hours. We don't have 5 hours at all. We have a maximum of 3.5 hours. 5 hours. Okay? For going to Sydney from a rural back area to going to the Sydney airport, it will take minimum of, because of the traffic congestion, it will take minimum 1.5 hours. Then you stay there at the airport. When your boarding call comes, here you spend 3 hours. Flight time is 5 hours, 8 hours. Why don't you go in a train? There are several train connections between Sydney and Perth. Even though it is not direct, it is via. Okay, next. Then came the drastic changes over the years. There are two things. One was the regulatory changes, one was the competitive environment. Regulatory changes were stabilized capacity to increased capacity. When airline business was started, it was very stabilized. They had a few capacity. In a particular sector, 200 passengers can fly. But now it is more than 200 went up to 2000. Market was captured by legacy carriers. Legacy carriers in the sense who are called the flag carriers. Flag carriers are nothing but the other state-owned carriers or the main carriers which fly, like KLM, Lufthansa, British Airways, American, Delta, Northwest. Then competition came with Air France, Southwest Airlines, other Atlas Airlines, Transfer, many things they came. The third was low diversity in offer to reduction of prices. In the earlier cases, what happened, there was no concept called the low-cost carrier. So there was a huge competition between the legacy carrier. If a Chennai-London fare is 10,000 rupees, the other carrier will give in 9,990. That was the small change. But now when you fly by Air Asia from Kuala Lumpur to London, you get a very cheaper fare rather than flying in a full-fledged carrier. Then slot distribution was based on the grandfather rights to slot auctions at big airports. Giving a slot allocation plays a major role in promoting civil aviation. In India, getting a slot is very difficult because of the restricted space availability in the apron and the infrastructure. Grandfather rights is nothing, but it is something called from where the legacy carrier starts its business altogether. Like Terminal 1B in Bombay is the grandfather terminal for Air India. All the flights which operate from Air India operates from Bombay 1B terminal. you know, now in big airports, lot auctions goes on. Bigger airports in India, we don't see bigger airport. Terminal T3 is not a terminal as you have Changi or Kuala Lumpur or Heathrow or Beijing airport. You know, these are, as compared to these world airports, these are very, very small. Even the whole of Indira Gandhi airport will come as one terminal for the Munich Lufthansa terminal. How big is it is. Then came airport as a strategic infrastructure to business hub. Nowadays, airports are not considered to be a only place where landing and takeoff take place. It's a business hub, it's a business destination, it's a MICE destination, it's also, it gives jobs opportunity to many more. For example, take the Dubai airport. Dubai airport is not an airport altogether, it's an attraction itself. When you look into the glasses and the doors, you see the whole airport, and everywhere you find something other different, you know. Then the competitive environment. Competitive environment was based on the endogenous factors and exogenous factors. Endogenous variables are the in-house variables like yield management. You know, nowadays in aviation industry, yield management is quite tough. It's very difficult to handle the inventories. Then is the hedging agreements. Hedging agreements is nothing but, you know, it's like we have the oil fluctuations every time. Okay, what airlines does? Airline cannot buy for a kiloliter of turbine fuel in 100 rupees. Tomorrow it will go 120. So they have an agreement with the supplier. For a brief period of 6 months of time, whether it goes up or down, you need to pay me a certain amount. Like 100 rupees is fixed. That is called the hedging agreements. Then the cost structure. If you look cost structure, both operation and administration. Airline business is always divided into two. Admin part, if you look at the airline salesperson, your job, payrolls and everything. Cost structure, buying an aircraft, maintaining, giving the landing fee, airport fee, aviation fee, all those things. This is the cost structure. Then is the capacity utilization. How much you utilize the capacity. You cannot fly a Boeing 747 with 340 seats empty. You know, you cannot fly with 200 people on board. Rest 140 is free. It's not occupied. That means it's loss. That is called the capacity utilization. Then is the mergers and acquisitions. You know, mergers and acquisitions is very, very critical and need to be handled very, very strictly. In India, if you look, in India, even though we say we have great mathematics and we have produced many good chartered accountants, but they never succeeded in mergers and acquisition. If you look there, Sahara and Jet Airways, it was a total failure. Air India and Indian Airlines was it was demolished the Indian aviation scenario altogether. Then came the exogenous variable, fuel prices. Fuel prices is always fluctuating because of the tensions between the United States of America and the Middle East. Then came the price of the aircraft. Now people are looking for all high-end aircrafts. Then the delivery. When an aircraft is manufactured, it goes for thousands of tests. The expenses incurred. Then when they come to the market, then there is a delay. Believe me or not, airline pay compensation to the, like for example, Airbus 380 when it couldn't be launched till now on a full-fledged manner. Still they are paying compensation to the airlines which have booked the A380 on confirmed basis because of the delay. That is called the price of the aircraft. Next. Then we saw a shift, you know. Then we saw a shift. Nowadays customer focused airlines. Nowadays airlines are very, very customer focused. You know, earlier days people used to be segregated on the base of their mileage. Oh, you are having mileage, okay. You are having 1,000 points, you are a privileged customer. You are having 100 points, you are not a privileged customer. You will not get a free economy, free upgrade to business class. But now it has gone to customer experience management. You know, how does a customer like your airlines? For example, if I am totally against the Indian aviation scenario, because in India we don't have any frontline airlines which provide the best of the quality services of the world. If you look into Emirates, if you look into small carriers like Cathay Pacific, you know, and Singapore Airlines with a fleet size of 80, they provide the world's best services. You know, services not only come only with the seating arrangement, but in the interior of the aircraft, what the services, that is what people feel, you know. Then came the Association of the European and US Airlines. Since Southeast Asia and Oceania part are not so developed in the world in the aviation, keeping up at Australia, because Qantas is one of the world's oldest airlines. It is one of the 5 airlines in the world which are very, very oldest. European and US Airlines. You see nowadays European airlines are going, they are merging each other because of the small travel time and of the high cost incurred. Then in the US airline system, now there was a merger between the Delta and the Northwest. You know, when the two airlines combine, the amount of capacity they generate, you know, they are having a fleet size of more than 600 to 700 flights, and per day it will be 3,000 flight taking off and landing. 3,000. Can you imagine in Indian airspace? 3,000 is a dream. Then comes the gravitational shift of market growth from Atlantic to the mega hub of the East. Gone are the days when LHR was considered to be one of the prime hub area for business traveler to change their flight, or Paris or JFK. Now it is gone. Now it is Changi, now it is Dubai, now it is Korea or Shanghai or Hong Kong. Then came the competition policy for airline industry. You know how competition emerged. Artificial concentration on certain routes by flag carriers came to siege. For example, take Air India. Air India was the only dominant player on the Middle East sectors. But later, open sky policy, it was bound to give opportunity to the private players, and Jet was the first private airline in India which was given the right to fly in the Middle East sector. So monopoly is broken. Okay, that is called the competition policy for airline industry. Then came the new operational models for airlines. The point-to-point of LCC carriers